Well, good morning, everybody. What a way to start the day. I am here going to the airport, headed down to Southern California for just a couple days to visit my nephew who is graduating from high school. So, always like to support family, wherever we can. So that's me being able to do this. And then I realized, wait a minute, I got a devotional I need to do. How are we going to do this? So Carolina's driving.
Hi, everyone.
So she's driving, I'm here. I know we got this thing's in the way, but that's all right. We can all put up with this. And reception might be a little spotty. So hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully you'll be able to see me. Otherwise, we'll just do the best that we can for today. So I'll be doing the devotional from California, tomorrow. But exciting things that are going on. Hope you remember it's Father's Day weekend, Men Weekend, Family Weekend. We got so many things planned at the church, for kids and photo booths and, cars, obviously, and giveaways. Why do we do this? Again, so that we can make sure we're building bridges and connecting with people who are not yet followers of Him. So make sure you're inviting, people who would never come to church, but they might come check out a cool car. So that's what we're doing. That's why we put these things on, and we'll keep doing things like that as long as we see what God's doing. So with that being said, jump in with me. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Let me just say, I was just telling Carolina, everybody's going to love me after this one. Once again, I did not write the words. I am just the messenger. So do the best we can, with our understanding here. Remember, again, this letter is a response. It's a response to what's happening in the church of Corinth. So there's specific issues. There's specific things they're dealing with. Now, much of which applies to all of us. Just like the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's so much that applies. There's principles that are still true. And so this one's kind of funny because they're going to use some modern day in Paul's day examples in order for us to be able to understand in our day it's going to be a little bit different. All right. So with that being said, verse 1, chapter 11, and you should imitate me just as I imitate Christ. Now, the thought process in this, if you were with me yesterday, is that this could be a reference to the end of his thought yesterday versus a new thought today. When he's talking about doing whatever he can for the love of other people in order for the gospel to be proclaimed, in order for the good news, in order to bring glory to God. And we need examples. We need people that we can follow. He tells this the same thing to Timothy. You might remember when he says, Timothy, don't let them look down on you while you're young. But you set the example. Allow people to follow you as you follow Christ. So there's okay that you have people that are willing to follow one another, be discipled one another, be encouraged by one another, and be under the authority of other people. So for Paul to even say, follow me as I follow Christ, is an example of somebody willingly putting themselves underneath the leadership or the authority of someone else. Okay, that's important as we set the context here. Now let's go to verse 2. I am so glad that you always keep me in your thoughts and that you are following the teachings I passed on to you. Now, you understand this is a sarcastic sentence from Paul now that you understand in context, because he's just spent the last 10 chapters telling them that they're not listening to what he has to say. So what he's referencing is that this is one of those, there's like 3 or 4 examples already gone through in Corinthians where he's kind of given a subtle jab, he's given a sarcastic remark, and this is one of those things. So he's kind of esteeming those who actually are following, him as he follows Christ, but he's also kind of pointing, a finger at, hey, for the last 10 chapters, well, we only have the chapters now, the last part of my letter, I've been telling you, why aren't you listening, why aren't you following, and that kind of stuff. Verse 3, but there is one thing I want you to know. The head of every man is Christ. The head of every woman is man. The head of Christ is God. Now, this is always where it gets really, really fun. To be like, what in the world is he talking about here? Understand, first and foremost, authority does not mean or equal inferiority. In other words, if somebody has authority, doesn't make that person who is underneath that person's authority inferior. Just think of it in a work context. You have a boss. I have a boss. If we have bosses, we are underneath their authority. Does that make us inferior in any way, shape, or form? No. It's just the role. It's just the situation. It's the position. It's the way in which you might find yourself in an employment situation. And nobody seems to complain about that. But we do when it comes to inside the home, and rightly so. because there have been many instances where this passage has been taken out of context. On the other side of it, as we're about to read, we also like to go back to the garden, as my wife reminded me, go back to the garden and say, well, this is one of the curses, that a woman is going to want to take control and oversee, and yet a man is going to overlord, and there's going to be this tension that's going to happen between this. But here's some roles that God set up. Now, before we get too excited, this morning, I love how Paul says, the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Okay, so what is this again? A willingness to put yourself underneath the authority of another. Christ is willingly putting himself underneath the will of the Father. And so we never look at that part of the sentence and say, oh my gosh, how could he do such a thing? Well, it's because it's actually done right. He willingly puts himself underneath, okay? So with that being said, let's get it on, and again, now it gets really fun. It says, a man dishonors his head if he covers his head while praying or prophesying. But a woman dishonors her head if she prays or prophesies without covering her head. For this is the same as shaving her head. Yes, if she refuses to wear a head covering, she should cut off all her hair. But since it is shameful for a woman to have her hair cut or her head shaved, she should wear a covering. What in the world is happening here, right? Here's what you need to understand. Context is key. In Greek culture, in Roman culture, among the Jews, in an express law, especially based on the Old Testament, no woman was seen without a veil. Now, when we think veil, we think of what the Muslims, wear, on a regular basis. Probably to not that extent. But in their culture, in public, not just the Christian people, you're talking about non-Christian world, there was continually a hair covering, a veil covering that was a form of modesty. Okay, that was what they did on a regular basis. So having a woman's head shaved in Jewish culture, meant adultery. You can read about that in Numbers chapter 5, verse 11. So remember, people are just coming into Christ. They're not completely disregarding the Jewish laws or culture. They don't need to do that, just like we learned about with food as it pertained to Peter. But what it means is they're just saying, you know what, this is what I've done, on a regular basis. And should I stop doing these things now? Well, actually, it would be a form of adultery. Also, in Greek world, it's the mark of a prostitute. Okay? So in the non-Christian world, in this day when it's written, if this person's hair was shaved, it was a mark of prostitution. You'd find this in the Corinthian places of worship, where they would worship the Lord, and they would not worship the Lord. They would worship pagan gods, and they would perform sexual acts. Well, most of the ladies there had their head shaved. So you can see the context in which that he's talking about there. Also, there were probably because he's responding, there's probably those who are Corinthian Christians, who are spiritual women who declared that since Jesus had set them free, that they did not have to then abide anymore by any of these laws or rituals, and I'm free to do whatever I want. Remember Paul's number one point. But what are you doing to proclaim the goodness of God? Don't allow your freedom to actually inadvertently or even inadvertently hurt other people, first and foremost, in their faith. Secondly, those not connected to Christ. Are we actually bearing witness to who he is? Okay, so that's the context in which he's writing, and that's why he's giving that specific. So the principle for us is also true. So if you're to say it today, day and age, let's just use the word modesty. So ladies, if Paul was writing to you today, he would write the word modesty. He'd say, don't show up to church in bikinis or low halter tops. And you'd be like, well, that kind of makes sense, because he's responding to that, because it's not actually helping other people. It's not helping you, and it's not proclaiming the message of Christ. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what he's talking about there, if we're to put it in our context. All right, so let's go to verse 7. A man should not wear anything on his head when worshiping, for man is made in God's image and reflects God's glory. And so you're like, okay, well, man, what does that mean? Because men oftentimes will wear the little, I forget what it's called, little
yarmulke.
Yarmulke. Thank you, Carolina. Little yarmulke, for praying. And so this idea of prayer and worship in head coverings, again, is just a cultural reference to what's going on. Just like today, I grew up in a day and age where if you came to church with a hat, you'd get scolded. Right? You would get yelled at by some of the folks in the church, and they would point to a scripture like this, and they would say, you're not to wear a hat at church. Don't do that. Now, some of them, were doing it because it's a sign of respect. Okay? Different ages, different times. I also remember we used to go to church dressed in our nines, I think is what they used to talk about. We used to dress up to go to church. We don't have to dress up anymore, but if it was one of those things that brought honor to God and respect to one another, we'd encourage people to do so. So we're not trying to make a minor a major along those lines, and Paul is just trying to remind people, again, if you go in context, back to chapter 10, what are we using our freedom for? Is it actually to help, or is it actually to hurt? Okay, then it says, then it gets even more fun from here. It says, for man is made in the image in God's image and reflects God's glory. And woman reflects man's glory. For the first man didn't come from woman, but the first woman came from man. And man was not made for woman, but woman was made for man. For this reason, and because the angels are watching, a woman should wear a covering on her head and show that she is under authority. This is why am I doing this? I should make Carolina, do this part, as well. Okay, so one of my favorite commentators is John Stott. It's one of my fathers as well. And what John Stott says, I want to kind of read this, and it's kind of a broader idea in context. Let me just read this in context. It is as if a great drama is being enacted. History is the theater, the world is the stage, and the church members in every land are the actors. God himself has written the play, and he directs and produces it. Act by act, scene by scene, the story continues to unfold, but who are the audience? They are the cosmic intelligences, the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. So you're like, what? Who's watching? The angels are. So when it says at the end, the angels are watching, and so a woman should wear her covering to show that she is under authority. So again, now we go back again to the issue of headship and everybody's favorite word, submission, in the broader context. Understand this. It is not, again, about this idea or struggle of authority in general. In fact, if you want to go historically, just in our own country, go back to the 1960s, there's been a massive change in how we see and accept authority. Okay? Citizens do not have the same respect for government authority as they used to. Students do not have the same respect for teachers' authority. Women do not have the same respect for man's authority. Children do not have the same respect for parents' authority. Employees do not have the same respect for their employer's authority. People do not have the same respect for police's authority. And Christians no longer have the same respect for church authority. So the question that is important to ask, has that been good to change? Has it been good to embrace all of that? We are so resistant as a society and culture. What does it lead to? Something called anarchy, when we're unwilling to put ourselves underneath authority. Now, nobody is saying, neither are the biblical writers, because we're going to read about women's leadership and prophecy and the ability to do that in the Bible anywhere. What we are saying, and what God is saying, is that there is an understanding and an opportunity for us to willingly submit ourselves underneath one another. Like in Ephesians, the same guy who wrote this, he starts out this conversation with, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. And he's talking about between a husband and wife. There is a mutual submission. But what we like to do is like, I'm not submitting, and that person's authority, these are antiquated thoughts and ideas. Like, no, there is a great thing that happens, ladies, when you submit underneath the man's authority. Two things happen, not in abuse, not in control. One, your man puffs up. Your man feels like he's honored. He feels respected. He feels like he has a part to play. And ladies, there is a growth that takes place in you when, although you know what's right, and although you know what there's a better way, and although we're talking about ideas of preference, there's an opportunity for you to grow and submit yourself to Christ. And so again, there's no demeaning, there's no underneath, there's no like you're less than or kind of stuff, but there is something that God set up that's healthy. Let me just remind you of how this works. And I don't know why. I don't know why God set it up this way. You can address that to him. But what we do know, here's what we know in the stats. If a man comes to Christ, 92% of the families, including the wife, will come to Christ sometime in their lives as well. If a woman comes to Christ, a mom comes to Christ, 46% of the family may come to Christ, the husband being the exclusion. So there's opportunities for us to invest in, to encourage and to uplift men, because left unto ourselves, we will always shirk responsibilities under things that we don't want to do, which is to say, you lead, I don't want to be a part of that. And so we want to be a church that continues to come alongside and helps men understand what does it mean to be a godly man, to be a godly husband, to be a godly father, so that submission becomes an easy thing to do for those who are ladies. And in the meantime, ladies, may you pray for, come alongside, support, and even challenge, your men, as their role is to die for their wives, which is not a fun thing. As I think about that, I'm like, oh, well, that doesn't sound very fun. But anyway, it's something that we should do on a regular basis. So hopefully I did the best I could while driving in the car, with Carolina. Carolina, how'd I do?
Pretty good.
Pretty good. So we'll have further discussions on that. So, all right, love you guys, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a great day. Let's continue to follow God's word in faith and in practice, and we'll see you tomorrow.